My name's Kathy Roll. I'm a psychologist in Edmonton, Stony Plain, and Beaumont, and previous to that I was a police officer with the Edmonton Police Service for 20 years. So I have like a personal and professional, obviously, interest in first responder mental health, and I've been lucky enough to transition from retirement in 2019 into full-time practice with psychology, and I serve basically mostly first responders and military and veterans. So essentially it was nice to be able to take lived experience in the first responder world and be able to actually help other people because of that. And so one of the things that I wanted to first talk about was sort of, what exactly is the culture around this? And of course this is sort of meant for spouses as well. So I think everybody here, whether or not you're an actually active member or whether or not you're a spouse, essentially the culture is very much about team mentality, fitting in, you don't want to be the odd man out, and then of course with that comes the whole stigma around mental health, because you don't want to be the weak link, and certainly also you don't want to be the person who is not attending, especially when you're like first on and you're really trying to make that good impression, because it's like, you don't want to say no to the team outings. A lot of things are very like, no spouses kind of parties and that kind of thing. And so essentially you're trying to manage this triangulation between home life, birthday parties, kids sports, school events, and of course maintaining your own romantic relationship, with also this cultural pressure of fitting in at work. And then of course also when you're not doing well, then you all of a sudden also are really kind of trying to hide that and push it down, because you don't want to be the one who's nobody wants to work with. And so what you end up in is this kind of internalized stigma of mental health, because the message from the outside is very much about don't be that guy, don't be unwell, and then at some point that voice becomes your own. And so basically you start stopping, you stop. So the culture is pretty tough in that sense, like we talked about earlier, and just sort of the pressures that come with that. And so essentially the other part is that there's this sort of functional disconnection that happens, where in order to do your job, you have to be able to actually disconnect emotionally from what you're seeing. And that disconnection becomes really, really functional all the time. Because, if things are going on at home, kids are upset, wife is upset, basically if you can sort of deal with them like you would deal with an inmate or a criminal, where you're like, hey, you know what, it's no big deal, don't worry about that. They're kind of going you're the most emotionally vacant human, and they want to have that emotional connection with you. So Gilmartin talks a lot about sort of that threshold for where we find crisis. And of course, when you're working all day in these places where you've dealt with self-harming and homicides and these very serious incidents, when your child falls down and scrapes their knee because they fell off their bike, most people who aren't first responders are going, oh my gosh, this is terrible, are you okay? And they're really attentive. And for us, it's well, you didn't lose your leg. I don't know what the problem is, So it's sort of that threshold for crisis, and our worldview around what's, really important and what we need to freak out about also changes. And to sort of the regular world, that makes us hard. We have black humor to cope with that kind of thing. And we suddenly start to feel very misunderstood as well, which of course rolls over into the family dynamic. So one of the other things that we would like to talk about is the fact that PTSD tends to really be the buzzword around stress and occupational stress, but there's way more different kinds. Essentially, there's moral injury, which is sort of the injury that occurs when you have a certain moral compass, and when you see or do or are made to do things that rub up against your core values and your morals, that can actually be injurious. And essentially, I like to use the example of a shoot, don't shoot scenario in the police service, where essentially, someone is put, or corrections as well, where someone is put in a position where they actually have to shoot someone. I always hate that term, it's a good shoot, because basically, yes, it's compliant with policy, but in the same turn, you just shot somebody, so that's the moral injury. It's it doesn't matter if it factually makes sense and aligns with the use of force continuum. You just shot somebody, and that's the moral injury. So there's that kind of injury. Then there's the vicarious trauma. A lot of people say when it comes to spouses and interacting with spouses that, don't go home and start telling them all the gory details. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the time, the vicarious trauma can also be around the water cooler at work. So, you know, when there's like some very serious incidents that happen at work and it becomes kind of the buzz because it's a serious incident, all of a sudden it kind of becomes the storyline for the next week or so at work. And so people that weren't there are hearing this stuff. And if your trauma bucket is already pretty full, depending on what the content is or what the actual story is, that too can have an impact on us. So we're also at risk of vicarious trauma as first responders based on what other people have seen. So that's why when it comes to like things like critical incident stress debriefings, for instance, you gotta be really, really careful around how are we telling our stories, right? Because we don't want to vicariously traumatize somebody. And so I know that there's been a lot of work done around that as far as making the place very safe when it comes to that stuff, because certainly vicarious trauma is a thing. Compassion fatigue, it's interesting because there's an argument that moral injury sometimes falls under compassion fatigue in some way. Because compassion fatigue, again, when we go back to the kid that fell off the bike, it's like, well, you know, and so again, like the threshold for what we would consider to be something that we need to really lean into changes. But the other thing is, from a moral injury perspective, compassion fatigue happens because we don't recognize ourselves anymore. I mean, people are self-harming. There's like, a lot of the time, the people that are in these prisons have had quite the stories, right? And so when you essentially are so emotionally disconnected, they actually don't even recognize yourself. Sometimes there's a moral injury there as well. And then there's the organizational stress. So the sanctuary trauma, the sanctuary harm that comes along with things like the organization, I think, is sort of like understood to be your protector. When you first get on, it's like, we're a family, we're gonna take care of you, and that doesn't happen. Like, you find out pretty quickly that all of a sudden there's a incongruency between what they say and how you're actually treated when shit starts hitting the fan, right? So there's actually research out right now that talks a lot about the fact that sanctuary trauma is more harmful to first responders than actually the events that they see as a course of their duties. I believe that. I can tell you in my office, you will never see a person come in with just an event injury. It's a lot of the time either 50-50 to the organizational harm and the events, or it's just organizational harm. It's the bullying, it's the harassment, it's the mistreatment. You know, sanctuary trauma is defined as like a failure to prevent or protect you from harm. And a lot of the time, they're the ones that are causing harm. And so that's very personal, right? You know, I mean, we can have relationships with inmates, we can have relationships with people that, you know, we see out on the street, but it's not the same, right? You know, as it is when it feels like you're attacked, right? Along the same thing when we talk about, so my thesis is very much on like, you know, the things that you lose when you leave the organization. Like, so it was very much about like identity loss. But one of the things that came up a lot is the sanctuary trauma piece and just sort of the emotional impact of feeling abandoned, feeling betrayed, you know, when it comes to things like, you know, again, you said you'd take care of me and now you're out to you know, fire me, right? You know, they do a lot of that, like, especially people that actually end up losing their jobs due to psychological injury. It's like, so you break me and you throw me away, yeah, right? And that's tough. That's a tough pill to swallow, right? So a lot of the time what I'll see with people with like really pervasive sanctuary trauma and moral injury is anger. And if we really kind of look underneath that anger blanket though, that's pain. That's grief. Like they're grieving this place and they're grieving what they thought it was. So 2 ways to develop PTSD. Obviously the way that we do is that complex PTSD. It's very much about like, you know, a bunch of different things in our shit bucket that end up basically overflowing and causing PTSD, as opposed to like a single incident PTSD where it's like, oh, I got hit by a car on the way, you know, or I got hit by a car in the parking lot and now I can't see red cars without freaking out. You know? So essentially what's interesting and the big difference between complex PTSD and single incident PTSD is that depending on what, you know, a single incident PTSD would be, but the complex PTSD has a really diminished view of self, view of others. The worldview really changes because it's kind of like this cynicism and, you know, that sense of betrayal and that kind of thing that comes with the interpersonal part of a complex PTSD, whether it's a moral injury or sanctuary trauma that's also combined with it. But you're not going to get that most of the time with like a single incident PTSD. It's more kind of just broad strokes, like everybody sucks, I hate people, I don't want to be around, you know, anyone because the world is bad, you know, and people are bad. So you don't get that typically with something other than a complex PTSD case. which is kind of another layer when it comes to treatment. So basically, there's a diagnostic criteria. The first one is, of course, something bad has to happen. And that's like, not necessarily something that you have to see it. You do have to see it, or you have to, like, you know, have it happen to you. But in the same turn, like, your favorite character dying on Game of Thrones is not something that's going to be a PTSD diagnosis, right? Like, it has to be something that's enormously impactful, right? That or something really bad happens to, like, someone that you really care about. So, you know, there's, like, something that has happened that is, like, you know, has a significant emotional impact on you. And then this is where you start to get the intrusions, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the intrusive thoughts, like that kind of stuff. So intrusions is the next criteria. And then the next one is avoidance. So that's where it's like, I'm not going to go through that intersection. I don't want to walk past the kitchen and corrections because bad shit happened there, and every time I go through it, the ghosts come out. Like, you know, it's just like all of a sudden I'm getting physical reactions to things, and you know what, it's just like I have a tough time shaking it. So avoidance starts happening. A big part, especially with complex PTSD, as I said, when it comes to that like kind of negative view of others, is I don't want to go out. I don't want to go to the grocery store. I don't want to go to the movie theater because something's going to happen. There's bad people out there, so I'm safe at home. And because we also have these big like emotional responses to things, like anger shows up a lot with PTSD. It's like, if some guy cuts me off in traffic, I'm going to get out and punch him in the red light. So it's like you also don't really trust yourself to cope well. So it's like, I'm just safe at home. Like, whether somebody does something stupid or I do something stupid, it's just better if I stay home. So that's where you really get a lot of people that are just like, I'm just avoiding everything. Again, we already talked about the negative alterations in cognition. So again, we go from like, let's give people the benefit of the doubt. Not everybody's bad, to like, nope, everybody's awful except my little group of friends, right? Gilmartin talks about the shrinking circle of asshole, where it's like, you get on the job and you're like, hey, you know what, like, I'm going to help, I'm going to make a difference, I'm going to go out in the world, and you know, there's like, you know, the white hats, which is all the law enforcement people, and the black hats, which are all the criminals, and then all of a sudden it's like, I don't really like those guys, though, right? So like, that squad, that division, you know, everybody's an asshole except the guys in North Division. Well, then it's just my squad. Well, then it's just my partner. Well, everyone's an asshole to me. So it's like the shrinking circle of asshole. And then basically, again, like we talked about, alterations and arousal. So these are things that have to be like significant and a change, right? So it's like, it's one thing I think if you have a bad day or a bad week or even a bad month, but this is stuff that's really changing. Anxiety's spiking, we're angrier, and usually, honestly, it's the spouse that notices first. And that's what I often say to my clients is like, if you're married and your spouse is saying that you're not doing well, you need to listen to that, because we endure, that's our culture. It's like you push through, right? You push through and you push it down, right? Just give me some more alcohol, it'll be fine, right? And so like, you know, basically if they're saying you're not doing well, it's time to start really paying attention to that. And so because of that, the spouses are kind of like at home, spouse walks through the door, I have PTSD, they're like, yes, you do. And now they're like, so now what, right? Like as a spouse, they're not mental health therapists, well, most of them, right? You know, like, so they're kind of like the ones who are on the front lines every single day dealing with a spouse who's injured, but in the same turn, they don't know what they're doing, right? So essentially what ends up happening is they start to feel really isolated and really trapped in their relationship, because especially if there's a lot of things like angry outbursts at home, there's maybe a lot more violence, there's definitely more fighting, people are taking things out on the kids, that kind of thing, and they're like, I don't think I can be here. I just don't think I can be here. And then they end up in a shame spiral, because it's like, what does it say about me if I leave my injured spouse? And so then they feel trapped, because it's like, I can't leave because they're sick, and or if I do leave and they get my kid every other week, I'm not there to protect them. So then there's this real sense of being trapped. And so then there's resentment. There's alcoholism on their part, a lot of PTSD comes up, especially if there's violence in the home, and then we end up in suicidality. So this is where we start to find spouses of people with PTSD that end up actually killing themselves, because they just feel like there's no other way out. And that's just a sad reality. And I'd love to actually see some stats on that, to be honest. So, that's fun. Also with the kids, a lot of the time, I don't know if anybody here is the child of a first responder or a military. Anybody? No? But that's the thing, like, you know, you hear that all the time where people are like, oh, you know, that's a cop's kid. You know, they should be better than that because they're a cop's kid, right? So there's a lot of pressure, I think, like, culturally, even without a parent with PTSD. But in the same turn, you know, like, a lot of the time when people have kids and the kids are in the playground and, like, you know, like, video games these days, what do? You shoot cops, right? You know, or like, you know, something really bad happens, like the defund the police movement that was going on. These kids are getting bullied in the schoolyard, right? So they end up having like a whole bunch of stuff going on. But if their you know, parent at home is not doing so hot, who do they talk to about that, right? Because they kind of know that if they bring it home to dad, it's probably not going to go so well. You know, we don't want to make dad worse. And so that's when we get this kind of like increased expectation where they feel like they need to be extra good. Because in their mind, if you think about the worldview of a kid, is it's like everything revolves around them. So there's very much that like, if I only scored that extra game in hockey, mom and dad wouldn't have been divorced, right? Or if I'm an extra good kid, then dad will be happier, right? Because that's just how they see the world, right? It's like the sun rises and sets around them. And so essentially they're like, they feel like there's this whole kind of like extra control that they might have that they really don't, but it's pressure they put on themselves. So unless we're communicating that, you know, to them, you know, they end up carrying a lot of that. The other thing is there becomes like almost like a surrogate parent dynamic that happens because especially with the older kids, they tend to kind of feel like they have to pick up the slack. You know, like if dad can't get out of bed or mom's not functioning, now they're all of a sudden raising the kids at the age of 9 or 12 or 15. And so there's also that piece, which can also have some, like, you know, obviously not positive kind of impacts, right? That's when I get them in when they're 20 and they're like, oh, that's my childhood. And I'm like, I know. So, what do you do about it? That's all terrible. What do we do about it? So basically, you know what, the first thing is like, you know, awareness, like, and I think that that's like what's beautiful about, I think any of these training places now, whether it's EMS, corrections, police, whatever, is that there's very much like an emphasis on mental health right out of the chute. You know, like there tends to be a lot more education around like, you know, get a therapist, talk about paint drying even, but once a month or once every couple months, like just go connect, demystify the process because, you know, if you can get in front of it and really develop a relationship with a safe human, you know, that's a lot better than like when you're like all of a sudden your bucket's overflowing and you can't function. So that's a big part, and it's nice because the organizations are doing that. And then of course places like this, right? You know, where we're having these conversations and just really destigmatizing that and trying to counter the culture, right?
Well, corrections are terrible for that. We don't like to get anything ahead of the game. We tend to just sit there and flounder until we sink.
100%.
That's what we're really good at.
Exactly. And so like what other self-care things do people do? Like what actually works now for you guys? Self-care wise.
Horses.
Horses, yeah. Weird, I didn't think you'd say that.
Exercise.
Exercise, yes, definitely. Anything else?
So many
Journaling.
things.
Yeah, and that's the
I
thing.
climb mountains. We take horses out every summer. Yeah.
So good.
I mean, PS gets left home to do chores, but that's
Yes.
okay. You know?
So,
What's that?
rightly so.
Yes. And you know what, honestly, like getting out in nature, honestly moving around matters. Like I really think like you gotta put it somewhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you just do. So yeah, lots of things. Rest, you know, is one, but not to a point where you can't get out of bed for days, right? Because that's depression and that's bad. So, you know, get a hold of that. But, you know, and then just really like talking to people. There's this thing called, what's it called? Social buffering. And basically social buffering is like, even if you don't talk, like you literally don't have to even talk about anything, like let alone all your traumas or all the things that are in your mind. Just sitting with another human being that you know you're cared about with, like they will, that helps. It just helps. And so, you know, just make sure you're reaching out, especially if you're single, right? You know, just make sure that you're actually like, you know, engaging your friends, right? That kind of thing. It's really important. And then essentially, like, you know, if you can, because if you think about like what they call the positive effects of trauma, so that's anger, anxiety, you know, like that kind of thing where you're activated, right? Like make sure you can practice those grounding skills. And then also with the negative effects, which is the things like depression, can't get out of bed, not eating stuff, you know, get up, move around, right? So, you know, do your best to kind of like pay attention to what's happening in your body too, because that really matters. For the spouses, the self-awareness piece around just make sure you're taking care of yourself. I think a really big part is like setting the boundaries with your spouse around what you want to hear and what you don't want to hear about. Because, you know, you want to be there for your spouse, and obviously, like, your spouse wants to protect you, right? So, if you can have an open conversation about, there's going to be times that you come to the door and I can see the look on your face that you're not doing well, but you know what, I want to say to you, how are you doing? Good day, bad day? Do you want to talk about it? Yes? Okay. But I don't want to hear about this, and I don't want to hear about that. And if that's what happened, like for me, it's always kids and animals. I don't want to hear about kids, I don't want to hear about animals. Those are always my rules. And so it's kind of like, if those are what you have, you know what, I'm going to support you about what do you need, right? But I don't want to hear the story. However, if there's a time where, say, there's a riot, something like that, where it's like, okay, I have the capacity, this isn't a trigger for me, so, you know, I don't have a problem listening to that. As a spouse, like, I often say, I'm like, put it up on a movie screen. Like, as they're telling you the story, pretend that you're watching it on TV. Because that way it sort of helps you emotionally distance from what's going on. And especially if it's your spouse that's obviously in the story, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's my husband, like, I don't like that, right? But at least if you think about it, like, you know, TVs and movies, like, they're not going to traumatize you. So if you can almost kind of just pretend that this story is happening, but it's like over there, right? It helps us kind of emotionally disconnect. And then the other thing is, like, when they are walking through the door, let's give them a hot minute before we're like, here's the grocery list, take the kids, I need you to run an errand, change the oil, right? Like, it's sort of like, if they need to have a few minutes to decompress, let's do that too. And these are all just conversations. This is just good communication between the spouse and the first responder. So that's really important too, because, you know, you hear often about how they're kind of walking through the door, it's been a hell of a day, and then it's just like, children, pissed off spouse, and it's like, oh my God, I need a minute to transition so that I can kind of like disconnect from work, put on dad hat, and then we can kind of go through our day. But it's important to do that because they're going to be able to tolerate it. And then also, I have this thing, you might have heard this all, but basically it's like the way that you can conceptualize your spouse when their PTSD is showing up strongly. So it's kind of like if someone says, you're being a bitch versus like you're acting like a bitch versus like you are a bitch, right? It's like, let's see if we can actually like change the personal attribution. So essentially it's like, instead of saying like, this person is being like horrific, they're being a terrible person, they're angry, and they start to actually, like, the spouse starts to view their first responder as a terrible, angry human, as opposed to, like, this is a symptom that's showing up. So it's like this person has PTSD, they are not their PTSD. And so it's really important to distinguish that. And so oftentimes, like, I'll say to spouses, like, you need to almost, like, make them a roommate. PTSD is like a roommate. So it's like PTSD Pete just showed up and he wreaked havoc last night in the house, right? So it's like, you know, it's the worst roommate ever. My slide literally says, worst roommate ever. Because it's like, nobody invited that guy over. He freaking like yelled and screamed and slammed doors all night. And then, you know, essentially it helps us separate to say they were really symptomatic as opposed to, you know, he was such an asshole last night, right? Because now we're having like this personal attribution to the person, and that's not who you are. That's not who you are, right? And so it's really important to do that because it also helps with like conceptualizing, you know, your spouse and viewing them from a compassionate lens, but also it helps the shame spiral. You know, if you can almost make it funny, like I had an EMS lady that I was like, what's her name? Let's name your PTSD. And she's like, Helen. And I'm like, why Helen? And she's like, because there's hell in the name. You know, it's like, yeah, exactly. Like she comes in angry, hot, yelling at the kids, all that stuff. But what they did is they were able as a family to be like, Helen, Jesus Christ, go downstairs. And then it becomes funny. Like if you can actually integrate humor, that's a good thing. Like if we can kind of just like have them redirect, stop whatever it is that's going on and actually laugh at it a little bit to be like, I'm taking Helen downstairs. She's like, yes, you are. Yes, you are. You know, that's a good thing, right? And again, it's like nice because what ended up happening with her too is all of her kids started naming their angry parts. And like, so basically, you know, we all have them, right? We all have these parts that are less desirable. And so it ended up actually becoming this really cool way to have a conversation when they're angry. You know, like, they have a 13-year-old girl that's got angst, right? You know, whatever her PTSD or her trauma or her angry part was, she shows up too, and that's okay, right? So it really is kind of a nice way to sort of like take your experience as a first responder with PTSD and actually say, you know what, like, let's all create some conversation around the fact that none of us are perfect, right? And it kind of helps normalize that too. So that's good. As far as spouses taking care of themselves, you know, a big thing is you're going to spend a lot more time alone. Like, unfortunately, you know, if we have a spouse that's really, really isolating, you know, we're going to have to start garnering a community and some friends because you're just not going to get, you're not going to get your spouse to go to the rock concert or the hockey game or the football game anymore. And so unfortunately, you're going to have to try and find ways to kind of like offset that with your other community members, you know, like your chosen family, bring your kids, like that kind of stuff. But don't stop doing those things, because if you're just going to be stuck at home with your spouse, that sucks. And again, that's not a quality of life for you, right? So it's going to look different, and I think like grieving the fact that your spouse is not who they used to be, and really landing on acceptance to a point of saying, maybe I don't need to fight this fight all the time, maybe we can look at this with some compassion. It's going to help with the resentment, but it's also going to help with your own quality of life. Because, you know, really at the end of the day, you just can't expect that the same things are going to go on, right? And that sucks, but unfortunately, there's a thing called PTSD accommodation syndrome. And essentially what ends up happening is spouses, I mean, okay, so if you think about exposure hangovers, so like, you bring your spouse out, they go to the hockey game, the next day they are a mess, right? Like they crash, they're exhausted, they're grumpy, they get home, they might even drink, right? That kind of thing, because they're just trying to numb out from this like crazy activating experience. And so essentially what ends up happening is, even though that's good for them, you gotta get them out in the community within reason. What ends up happening is spouses start going like, you don't have to. Don't worry about it, I'll just go to the barbecue by myself. I'll take the kids to the birthday party by myself. And so unfortunately, they start doing this PTSD symptom accommodation cycle where it's like, now they're actually allowing their spouse to continue their isolation, which actually makes them worse. So it's tough because it's a bit of a teeter-totter for spouses, because it's like, we need to try and get them out into the community and have positive interactions because that's what's gonna help them heal. But in the same turn, you don't wanna have to deal with the fallout at home if we push too hard, right? So it's sort of like trying to figure out, as a couple, right, it's us against the problem. So as a couple, what's within the window of tolerance there? Because if we start pushing and they're just like really not doing well, right, maybe the first thing we're gonna do is not take them to a rock concert. Maybe we'll take them to like out for dinner at a quiet restaurant, right? So again, kind of like trying to figure out ways that you can have a little bit of outside time with your spouse, but, you know, within reason. Kids, as we talked about, basically that's very much about just good communication, making sure it's not their fault, right? Just because you didn't score that game, or that goal in the hockey game does not mean that that's why dad is sad. So that kind of thing, making sure essentially that when there are ruptures, and there will be, because even parents without PTSD lose their shit sometimes. I literally just went out for lunch with a girlfriend of mine who's got a 5-year-old with ADHD. She's like, I'm like, yeah, yes, all that, right? You know, so, I mean, but these are opportunities to demonstrate that people are fallible, and it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay and important to apologize. So, you know, like, it's really important to, like, not blame as the person who's lost their shit, and basically, you know, use it as an opportunity as opposed to shame spiral about things like, people are imperfect, we just are, it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to apologize, right? Important. So we can kind of look at these things from a place other than shame that way. Tagging out, I'm gonna lose it, tag out, right? And your spouse can be on board with that. Even if there's a safe word involved in that, where it's like, pineapple! Spouse comes running from the other room. You know, something like that, you know, again, it's kind of like safety planning, right? debriefing ruptures, as we talked about, educating your kids on trauma, like, you know, basically kid language, you know, but basically, you know, like whatever age they are, you know, a little bit of education that helps them understand that, you know, sometimes dad gets mad, you know, not your fault, like that stuff matters. So ultimately, you know, treatment approaches is very much like, as a family, if you don't have, like, let's say a couple, if you don't have the husband and wife doing their own individual work, you're just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. I mean, basically, like, couples therapy without individual work is going nowhere. You basically have to make sure that both of you are doing your own work, but then also that there's like some couples therapy in there to talk about patterns, you know, and how as a couple we can address the PTSD and the injury together, and not only adjust but grieve, and then ultimately land on acceptance, so that when things like PTSD shows up in the room, together you can come up with a plan for that. Treatment approaches, just making sure that getting appropriate trauma therapy as opposed to just going to therapy. Everybody can go and talk about their weekend, right? But, you know, sometimes it's important if you've got a bucket full of trauma, you know, making sure you're actually seeing the right therapist. Group therapy, communication skills training, assertiveness training, anger management, obviously. And then actually tapping into a lot of the things like, you know, boots on ground is a great example. Wounded warriors, you know, there's a lot of really great programs out there to actually get the spouse supported as well, which I think is really important. One of the nice things that I'm seeing over the last, I'd say even like probably 5 years, is that there's a really huge awareness of the fact that a lot of the time these spouses are feeling very, very alone in their journey. And so, you know, being able to actually connect them with the community as well is really important. So that's huge. And then ultimately just, yeah, you know, like doing the work, there's, Veterans Affairs and Wounded Warriors has this thing called COPE, which is like couples overcoming PTSD every day. There's Can Praxis, which is the horse one. You know, so there's also things for couples, and just, you know, finding out probably through a lot of different networks and that kind of thing that, you know, there's support out there. So taking care of you, taking care of your spouse, and then ultimately just really kind of moving towards like an understanding that when there's PTSD in the marriage, like, and we call it PTSD in the marriage, because it affects everybody, right? It's not just this person. It's like PTSD has now affected this marriage. But, you know, it doesn't have to be something that is like overtaking the relationship. It just means that there needs to be some conversations around how, when this is showing up, do we cope with that? So whether it's dealing with the kids, dealing with each other, dealing with yourself, taking Helen downstairs, right? But at the end of the day, it's just a change. Right? I mean, every couple is going to be faced with problems, cancer, MS, Parkinson's. This is just ours. And so at the end of the day, you know, good communication and just really some good positive regard. I think like a big part too is like, you know, it's easy to not celebrate the wins, like when you see improvement, if your spouse is going to therapy and all of a sudden they're sleeping and they're less shaky and they're eating and they're not drinking anymore. Like a lot of the time it's easy to get so focused on the ruptures that you're not actually also seeing the wins. So that's always a really big message too, is just making sure that we're actually balanced on our approach around, you know, how we're viewing our spouse at the end of the day. So that's it. Questions?
Do we have any questions? Do you have any questions for Catherine?
But I just want to say I love that bit about noticing the wins. Somebody came to me, a client actually, and said, she heard the expression glimmers and I stole it and I'm using it. And it's the opposite of triggers.
Yeah.
So yeah, we all say, oh, it's a trigger, but have we noticed the glimmers? Like, hey, did you notice you slept through the alarm this morning? Or hey, you know, you really dealt with that well last night. Or hey, I really appreciate you listening to my problem this morning. Or we miss the glimmers.
Yeah, it's so true. And they say that depression, anxiety, and PTSD are the most narcissistic disorders out there. And the reason that they say that is because you're in your head all the time, and it's really hard as the person who has them sometimes to actually take off, you know, basically to see past the end of your nose, right, and realize that it's like, oh, how was your day, honey? How was your hockey game, kiddo, right? Because you're just constantly dealing with these intrusive thoughts, sleeplessness, feeling like crap, cognitive fog, you know, all of this stuff that just causes a person to be in their own head. And then especially if you also couple that with chronic pain, which is a really big, you know, mood altering thing, but also something that just like 100% will keep you so like, you know, in your own head that you're really kind of missing all of the other things. But in the same turn, you're right, you know, because of that, they're missing the glimmers too, right? You know, so, yeah.
That's my new one, watch for glimmers.
Watch for the glimmers.
Pretty sunrises, pretty clouds, whatever they are.
Yeah, and it does, like, it's nice to know when PTSD Pete's not in the room, you know, right? Where it's like, man, we actually had a really good night last night, like, it was great to go for dinner, and, like, you didn't freak out, so, you know? Like, that stuff is good.
Well, and I think like what you said with having your spouse be able to say that communication of,
Yeah.
you're not doing well.
Yeah.
Because I know Thea's told me that.
Yeah, yeah.
And, you know, when I walked in after shift at Bowden one time, I walked in and I had a landing. And I walked in, I always took my boots off there. Well, I didn't just put my boots on, I flung them across the entry. And he's like, oh, so something's going on here, he says. And then, well, now he's gone. But anyway, so.
He's like, I gotta go.
Yeah, he's like, you know, 100%. He flat out told me not too long ago, you're not doing well.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And you're not ready for you know, and stuff like that. So the honesty of that is big. Because obviously I make more than him, so it's a big thing for him to say, you're not ready for work yet. Anyway.
Yeah, we don't want to believe it. Like, I think that's the thing. Like, nobody wants to. It's okay for everybody else to get it, and I think, like, you know, from a cultural perspective, like, there's a lot more support out there.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the stigma's still there, but it's definitely less. But you can't have it.
Yeah.
And like, you know, it's interesting. I was just talking to one of my students the other day about this, about like delivering the diagnosis matters, like how you deliver the diagnosis, because when you're like, you know, you're doing the paperwork and you're kind of just like, okay, we'll get your WCB stuff in, and yeah, you got PTSD, and they're like, wait, what?
Yeah, now what?
What? Like, and you know, you just kind of like, you really got to be mindful of the fact that it's like, if this is the first time you're hearing this, like that can be really impactful, right? Because it's like, what do you, like, that's what other people get, right? So that can be very tough.
Well, I don't think anybody in corrections, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm pretty sure everybody in this room would say, if you work in corrections for any length of time, you have PTSD.
Oh yeah.
Of some sort.
Yeah.
And like, what was your first clue when I started having malfunctions? Like,
I don't know. Can I narrow it down to a top 10 list?
Yeah. He's like, I'm getting, this is a trap. Don't answer that.
That makes a good point, because it's everybody but me.
it is.
Yeah.
I'm okay. No,
Yeah.
no.
I've had a couple of bad
The
days.
whole
but-
industry of people who are taught to push through.
Yeah.
But again, I teach this, and everybody has it. Not
Yeah.
me, not me. That's
Yeah.
it. We're all screwed up, right?
Yeah. Oh, and that's what I often say. I'm like, nobody gets out of this career without it. It's just how bad.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, literally, that's it. Like, you can literally just start at, it is a given. It's just a severity. Like, that's what we're dealing with when we're coming out of these jobs for any length of time. And that's okay. That's normalizing, I think. So.
I find it kind of entertaining, like since I started CX Solid, how many people I walk up to and say, hey, I'm doing this presentation. Do you want to come to the, oh, I'm fine.
Yeah. Ooh,
Honest
no.
to God, I'm fine. Do you know how many times I hear that?
Can I catch it? I don't want to catch it.
Really? Because I just saw something that wasn't fine.
Mm-hmm.
But who am I to say, right? So, anyway, thank you so much, Catherine, for coming.
You're welcome.
I'm sorry this didn't work out.
Oh, that's
but
okay.
I want you
I
to
like
take
my slideshow.
your slideshow's amazing. Anyway, okay, so guys, we have Janelle here.
No, we're going.
Janelle is at Boots on the Ground.
Hello,
She agreed to do a little presentation for us on what they offer us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janelle.
Hi everybody, I'm Janelle. I'm now a parole officer at Edmonton Institution. I was a correctional officer for 6 years. I'm involved in lots of things, but my most favorite thing is obviously Boots on the Ground. So Boots on the Ground is a peer-to-peer support hotline for first responders by first responders. Meaning everybody, it's a hotline. You call the number. Everybody answering the phone is either an active or retired first responder. But everybody calling the line does not have to be a first responder. I know we say it's peer-to-peer, but we don't ever turn away a call. We will take every call coming in, whether it be, you know, we are based out of Alberta, but if you call from Nova Scotia, we're going to take your call. You call from Ontario, we're going to take your call. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's calling. We'll never turn a call away. If you're a spouse, if you're a child, we're here. We're here to talk. The comfort is knowing if you are a first responder and you want to talk to someone who understands where you've been, we are there. So Boots on the Ground is a charitable organization. We operate solely on donations. We don't make any money from anything. Everybody volunteering is exactly that, just volunteers. Nobody is a paid position in Alberta. Ontario has been around, they are our mothership, they're the ones that started this, and Mo Showcott brought it to Alberta about, we've been online operating for just over a year, but it's been in the process for about 3, getting it here. He saw a need, so he took action and approached them and started it here in Alberta. So Ontario's been up and running about 5 years, almost 6 years, I guess now. And in their first year, they took around 40 calls. In our first year, we took over 180, which says that, like you kind of mentioned before, the stigma's slowly getting beaten down. People are slowly starting to recognize that it's okay to talk about it. But it kind of says that the need is there. People need to talk. People need to get it out. There's comfort in knowing you're talking to someone who understands even a little bit of what you've gone through. So when we talk about first responders, we are talking about, well, boots on the ground is talking about. So we include firefighters, correctional officers, peace officers, sheriffs, police, paramedics, nurses. We also include 911 or dispatchers in general, as well as military members, active or retired in all departments. Yeah, I don't know, I love boots on the ground. I love everything we do. I think it's very, very important to have somebody there available, willing to take the time without pressure. It is 100% anonymous. If you call our line, we do not know who's calling. We do not have call display. It comes up as a no caller ID. The only way we know is if you tell us your name. I always disclose, actually all call takers, we disclose our names. Boots on the ground, Janelle speaking. But if the caller doesn't want to tell their name, we will not ask. That's their information to provide. The only time a call is no longer anonymous is if it is an active suicidal caller. At that point, 911 is dispatched. The police will have access to the phone number and they will attend the scene. We as call takers, or even as boots on the ground, will never know who they went to, where they went to. We don't ever get access to that, making it 100% anonymous. We offer other services. So it's not just the phone lines. In Ontario, they do have a therapy dog program. They have training programs. Like there's a lot of programs that happen in Ontario and in Alberta. We've started, like we have a CISM, so a critical incident stress management outcall coordinator. If there's a community agency that's requiring some sort of a CISM debrief or a CISM individual intervention, it is organized that someone from Boots on the Ground will go and attend to them in the community. We've recently done one with a trucking company, actually out of Calgary. They attended a horrific scene and they asked for it and we went. It doesn't have to be first responder, but that was a horrific event for them, required some extra care, and we went to that. We have WCB specialists as well. We have a chaplaincy program. We eventually would like to get a therapy dog program that is in the works. What else? Everybody, all of our call takers are trained in ASSIST, so Applied Suicide Intervention, CISM, Critical Incident Stress Management, and then they have an in-house training. All call takers are trained in this. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Before you actually answer a telephone call, you are fully, completely trained. All training is no cost to our volunteers, so if anyone ever wants to volunteer, it's, we don't make you pay to be a volunteer. Yeah, we do CISM in-house. I'm actually a trainer. Adib is a trainer as well for everybody, and we do, for Boots on the Ground, we do it all virtual, so in terms of CISM. ASSIST is always done in person. And I think that's mostly it. There's not much other than it's awesome, and if you ever need to talk, please call.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So how do you guys decide who's, like, is there always somebody there, and is it always somebody from Alberta, or can it be
So,
Ontario?
all of our volunteers are Alberta based. You do have to go through a recruitment process. We have a recruitment manager. We actually have 2 of them. They do all the vetting. It is like applying for a job essentially, but much more fun because you get to talk about how awesome you are and why you're so good at this, and what you want to do. But all of our calls, all of our shifts for calls have 3 people on the line. So we have a primary and then we always have 2 backups. We want to make sure that no call goes missed, that all calls are answered. So if the first call, if someone's calling the line and our first call taker is on a call, it will automatically dispatch to number 2. If that one is on a call, then number 3 gets it. It's not often we get to number 3, but I will tell you, we've already had a couple instances where we have gotten to number 3. It doesn't happen often, but it can. So every shift is a 4-hour shift, except the overnight is an 8-hour. So all of those have 3 available call takers. As a volunteer, we ask that you give at least 16 hours of volunteer hours a month, which is just on shift. Now you could be on those shifts and never take a call. It can happen, right? You might be a volunteer and never be taking a call and be like, what am I doing? But you're still needed. We still need people there to be ready and willing. We do ask our volunteers not to really stop your life when you're on a call, right? A lot of people think I gotta sit in front of the computer, I gotta do this. It doesn't, we encourage everybody to incorporate boots on the ground in your normal everyday life. So I'm gonna go grocery shopping or I'm gonna go out for dinner. But if I get a call, I just step away. I go sit in my car and I take that call. That's it. Some calls, actually most calls aren't crisis calls. Most calls are just people wanting to talk. And that's what it's about. I know we talk about it a lot in when we're doing CISM in the institution, right? I call it always coffee with a friend. I treat boots on the ground like coffee with my friend. I want to sit, I want to listen, and I want to validate, right? That it's okay and what you're going through is normal, and there's no shame in it. That's it. It's coffee with my friend. So I treat all of those the same. And that's what Boots on the Ground is. We're just here to support, and we're ready and willing to listen. We also, the other things we do when we are on the phone is if the call taker or the callers want to explore like resources, we take the time out to do that. If they need external things, we refer them to an advocacy where we have that advocacy with Boots on the Ground has a little bit more time to research and gather the materials or the resources that these people need. We don't just leave them in the wind, right? We're there to support them. Yeah, we're there to support them, we're there to help them. We build a resource database so that it's a little bit easier. We actually just got connected to 211. So we are now a 211 resource, which is super exciting actually, because it's not, yeah. So if you go to 211, and we'll be one of the things that are available for people in need. Yeah, I think that's really it. Does anyone have any questions?
How do I get a resource to somebody? Like if someone's like, hey, yes, I would like some, coping skills handout or something. Like, is that sort of like your resource database?
So we have online, so my cards and everything are there.
Oh, I'm stealing all of it.
Yeah, on our website.
Yeah.
We do have resources that are reconnected with. Actually, Pika's Equestrian has just gotten to be up there one. So we do have a list of vetted resources that we have. We are always, if a call taker wanted to Google, we would Google. And be like, okay, these are what we're finding in the community. We really strongly encourage 211 because that resource goes across Alberta.
Okay. So like if I said like, okay, so I phone in and you say I have this amazing handout that is super relevant to how you're feeling, and I'm like, yes. So then I would just provide my email address or something to you then? Like,
you could if you wanted.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you didn't want to give us personal information, we would walk you through on the internet.
Okay.
Like,
thank you.
We would help navigate you
right
to get to where you because, and that's where the anonymity comes in.
Yeah, that's what I was like, how do
Yeah,
you
if
get that?
people
Okay, that makes
don't-
sense.
And we just take that time.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
our call takes an hour, if it takes an hour and 15 minutes,
Right,
we're on there, we're walking you through, click here, this is how we found it,
okay,
this is where you can go.
okay, perfect.
But
That makes
that is also where the advocacy comes in.
Yeah,
If they were to reach out to the advocacy at BOTG Alberta, then yes, we have their email address,
right,
but it's only that advocacy person, right? It's not a random call taker.
okay,
It's that advocacy person that has it
yeah,
and can guide you through an email.
okay, thank
Right.
you, that's perfect, thanks.
I was moving.
That's where the extra peanut butter would
But
come in.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. Yeah, so that's what we do, that's who we are, and,
Okay, this is something that's been in my brain, it has really no relevance to anything here, but I was curious about this. How weird is it when somebody phones, because we are all from first responder situations? Like,
how weird is it?
How weird is it when somebody calls and you actually recognize who it is? Does that ever happen?
I'm sure it's happened. And it's not actually weird.
Okay.
Because the only time, as the call taker, we wouldn't disclose that we know you. As the caller, if you said, Janelle, I know it's you, this is Stacy,
Yeah.
I would say, thank you for calling.
Oh.
Right?
Okay.
It's not actually weird because then it just becomes a personal relationship. If you said, I don't want to talk to you, I would say absolutely.
Okay.
And I would allow you to call back.
That was my next thing.
Yeah, so if you said I would prefer to talk to someone, whoever, I would say, okay, this is my backup caller, like my call taker. Do you want to call right back? Or I won't be on shift tomorrow at all, call anybody tomorrow, right? So as the call taker, we wouldn't think it was weird
Okay.
because that's what we're there to do. And I wouldn't tell anybody, right? The anonymity, confidentiality is huge, right? We do have tracking sheets that get filled out and completed and handed in after every call. Names don't ever go in there. So even though the caller calls and says, this is, my name is Stacy, this is what I'm going through, la la la, your name would never go in that tracking sheet. It would just, it's literally like, if it was female, she said she's from corrections, and wanted to talk about resources in the community, right? There's no personal information that ever goes in anywhere. It truly stays on the call there. If we do have repeat callers, which it happens, we do have repeat callers. We have people that need to talk on a regular basis, and we will take those calls. We would never turn them away. But yeah, it's really up to the callers, like, however, whatever, how they want it to go.
Choose your own adventure.
Yeah. And we have had calls too where they call and they're venting and that's all they want to do. And then they will just hang up. And you're like, great, okay, that was it. And we're okay with it. So, yeah, it's 100% up to the call
If
taker.
it's okay, I'm gonna pick up on that for a second, because this question comes up in every system class.
Okay.
Is what if somebody doesn't wanna talk? And I said, personally, I still struggle with this after being on system for 15 years.
Okay.
And every time I talk to somebody, they always talk. Because in class, we always make it hard on each other. But in life, again, I'll go to somebody thinking they will never talk to me, and as soon as you open the door, they talk. Like it's in your head, like nobody's gonna talk to you. It's like, no, everybody wants. So same thing. Even if they recognize you, they'll talk. They're not thinking, they don't care it's Stacy, they don't care it's Paul. They're calling to talk. I know it's one of those things as humans, like, what if they don't want to talk? I've done thousands of interventions. They all want to talk.
Yeah. Even if you were to call the line and we introduced ourselves and you sat there, we would sit there until you hang up. Like, I'm not hanging up on you. If it's just silence and we hear breathing or we hear anything, we will sit there for you until it is 100% we are there to support you through whatever it is you're going through in that moment. And to prove the anonymity, I have had people come to me and say, I called boots on the ground. Well, I'm friends with them. Great. I had no idea, right? There's no way for me to know that you've called, but I love that you called. I just, yeah, it's just that way, right? We don't, as call takers, we don't call the next people and be like, oh, so-and-so called me and so-and-so called me. It's not a thing. That call's done, it's over with. We let them move on, so, yeah.
Very cool.
It's awesome.
I love that. That's awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So, anyway, Eddie, Susan.
Thank you. Oh, wow, big boost to follow here. Happy and Janelle and Stacy.
Not me.
No, well, no, honestly, I say this a lot about Stacy. She saw a need and she just went ahead and did it. She didn't care.
She's crazy.
I remember the jail said no to her. She's like, I'm bringing my horses in.
Yeah, fuck you, I'm doing it.
That's not, and now the jail takes credit that look what we did. I'm like, no, she had to fight you guys for this. So that's you know what, seeing a need and just saying, hey, and that's honestly why I became a assistant instructor, because in 2017 I sat in a class and I saw a real need and I'm like, oh my God, I want to help. So and again, I myself struggle with a lot of this stuff, so it's perfect. So my name's Adib Kadura. I've been in corrections altogether 25 years, provincial and federal. Like an inmate, started young offenders, went to remand, went to Fort Saskatchewan, did probation, house arrest, and been federal for 23 years completed this next month. So yay. Did it 2 years at the women's, so I don't know where that goes into that. So. But anyway, so that's the thing. So I am a national system instructor for CSC. I've been doing it for 7 years now. Teach literally from Moncton to Victoria. And I have my lovely assistant, Janelle, who's helped me a few times to teach. So I love having her around. So, and again, she'll So a bunch of things is, we're gonna kind of cover this. But first, I'm gonna step back for a second before I talk schism. Sun Tzu in the Art of War says, to beat an enemy, you have to know the enemy. We all talk about stress and PTSD and all that stuff, but what is it, right? The word stress itself, a psychologist in the 50s and 60s actually used to be a physicist. So he brought it over from stressing metal to over to the psychology world. So I'm the geek that wants to know, where did this word come from? Why did this happen the way it is? So again, but what is the stress itself? So this is gonna draw for you guys. What is stress? When we say stress, what is it? So there's millions of things, but I'll mention a few things that we kind of get used to. The chronic stress. What's chronic stress? It's normal, everyday, bills, family, kids. This is where normal people live. This is everybody happy, you know what I mean? Life goes on, it's up and down, nothing crazy. But then, we get to the acute stress. This is us, on your corrections, things are wonderful. We go outside the normal. Most people experience this are the normal people. And what's funny, first time I heard this, normal people experience 2 to 5 critical or traumatic incidents in their life. And first time I heard this, I was at a conference and I actually got quite upset. I'm like, that's it? That's way more. And I remember I left and I went to my hotel room because it was in the same building. And I thought about it. My brother, the engineer. My brother, I have 8 brothers and sisters. My brother, the engineer. My brother, the barber. My sister, the accountant. None of these people experience, what we experience is crazy. We experience murders, hostage taking. Even our clientele, there's documentaries about them. I've literally seen documentaries, not on purpose. One time I remember I'm watching, he was a serial killer from California. And I'm watching A&E once. And all of a sudden my prison is on TV, on A&E, right? I'm like, oh my God. That alone is almost triggering, right? So this spikes us. But again, we're gonna go physics for a second. So what goes up? Yeah, and for every action? There is an equal and opposite. So what happens? We crash, right? So we go home. So this is the excitement of the incident, right? Oh my God, that was awesome. That was a thrill, right? Did you see the blood? Wow, you did a great job. But then guess what our family gets? I don't want to talk. Right? Kathy just talked about that, right? I just wanna sit at home. You watch the hockey game? No. Well, we got tickets, yeah, who cares, give them away. Is it fair for our family to get this? And this is daily for us. This is daily, right? And what happens, we're exhausted, we're tired, we don't wanna do anything. This is who we are. But then there's one more that we deal with. So this is a huge stress, post-traumatic stress, which is, whoosh, we shoot up. What happens with this one is we stay up here all the time. We never crash. You go home, you can't sleep. You can't even eat. You're so excited that you can't even think about those things. You're always up. Hey, what was that noise? Who are those people out there, right? You hear everything. Everything's a trigger. Everything's a danger, right? Because why do we, I drop off my kids at school. I don't leave them until they go in, because there's pedophiles out here, right? Oh my God, I make sure I shut all my documents before I put them in the garbage, because somebody's gonna go through that. Why? Because I live in the BTS world. I never crash. 2 in the morning, I wake up again. 3 in the morning, I wake up. I go to the bathroom, I go home. I check the doors again. You guys check the doors at 3, 4 in the morning again? Once, twice. You've locked it yourself, but guess what you're gonna do? You're gonna go down, have you guys gotten out of bed and go check the locked door? I did that last night. Literally, last night I did that. And I'm like, I'm the one who locked it. Nobody opened it. This is where we worry. So, again, so that's kind of the stress, and this is kind of where we're getting kind of CISM. This is where CISM kind of helps you. Now, what is CISM? And there's a lot of controversies about CISM because I'll share this with you guys. And recently I had 20 psychologists out in BC attend my class, and they actually told me they came to discredit CISM. But after the class, they're, oh my God, this is not what we thought it was. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand CISM. CISM is not therapy, and it is not a substitute for therapy. It is has nothing to do. Therapy is amazing, and its role is huge. It saved my life. I know that for a fact, as a person who struggled with my own mental health. Therapy is huge. But in the continuum of care, we have physical first aid, we have ambulances, we have the emergency room nurse, we have the ICU nurse, we have the operation room nurse. That's where CISM is, physical or psychological first aid. It has its role. Now, 90% of the time, we put the Band-Aid on, gets it better, and we send you off on your own, and you're okay. That cut, if untreated, could turn into an infection. Infection could lead to amputation and maybe even death. So CISM itself, it is not therapy. It does not claim to be therapy. It will never be therapy. We are not therapists. We are not gonna take over and try, sit you on a couch. A huge part of CISM, we use what's called the SAFER-R model. It's an acronym for stabilizing, all of that stuff. The R is a referral. So if somebody needs a referral, it is a huge part of the CISM model. So a lot of people, I'm sure everybody has heard, I don't know if CISM works, it does do more damage. Those people have heard things that are completely wrong. So CISM itself is just first aid and nothing more. A lot of times, that's all people need. A lot of times when people have PTS or up here or down here, we just need those basic needs. A lot of times when you're stuck in trauma, what happens? We do not eat, we do not drink, because our brain is survival mode and survival mode only. When we eat, it tells our sympathetic and sympathetic systems that everything is back to normal, we can go back to normal. This is where CISM is. CISM is that check-in. Maybe you're up here, hopefully we can bring you down here before we send you off back to your family. Maybe you're down here, hopefully bring you up here. Again, CISM itself is just first aid and nothing more. If the reason it works, I use the analogy of concrete. If concrete is wet, you could easily mold it. You could push it, you could make it flat. The longer it takes, that's when I need the psychologist, the professional now that has way more tools than I do because it's becoming solid. So that's where CISM is really important. It's an immediate tool. It's not 6 months later. I've had calls, people like, I had one time, I'll never forget this, a senior staff member. I was taken hostage in 1991. Oh my God, you need trauma help? He's like, well, you're a CISM. Yeah, you know what, that's like somebody telling you, I've had a kidney infection for 30 years. Oh my God, go see a surgeon. I got a Band-Aid if you want. That's where a lot of people. So that's what CISM is, very simple. It is exactly what Janelle said. Coffee with a friend. It is checking in on people in the moment they're really struggling. it's confidentiality is a big one. And where CISM really is important, you'll notice things when people take CISM training, where you're looking for things beyond, because your friend is looking at you, oh, that was crazy. But I've seen incidents where a manager couldn't pour a cup of coffee. The trauma takes over the brain. Basic, we call them active daily livings, you can't do them anymore. A young lady one time, I walked her out to her car, and honestly, for no other reason, just to make sure she's okay. And she walked around her car 5 times. So you know what I did? I opened the door and sent her off. No, I'm kidding. We got her a ride home, right? But that's where CISM really excels, because you're looking for those extra things. That person, I pick up that cup of coffee and I put it down 30 times, not taking a sip. So that's what CISM is. Now, with CISM itself, something really important, there has to be a critical incident. I cannot just come in here, okay guys, we're gonna give you CISM. It is literally in our name, Critical Incident Stress Management. Now this really becomes a debate. What's a critical incident? Murder? Honestly, why know what's crazy? Is people actually do better in those massive bad incidents than in some of the minor incidents. So one's own perception is their own reality. If they perceive it to be critical incident, it is not up to me to judge it. So if they are struggling, that is on them, not on me. So as a CISM peer, I cannot go in and like, oh, Stacy again, God, everything's a trouble. You know? Yes, there is those people, and I'm sure there's the crazy people at the hospital that go in because they have cancer and they literally keep them out of emerge because they're just hypochondriacs, right? Same with CISM, we have those examples. But if they perceive it to be critical, I cannot be like, you know what I mean? And again, we are not therapists, we're just psychological first aid. So that's where CISM really excels, because it's like I said, wet concrete. If we can mold it, we can help you, we can get you the ride home. Like I said, I can attest to this. I've saved many, many lives because we were there at those exact moments. People have, you know what I mean? You're that one person that genuinely saw what nobody else saw in that room. You ask that right question, and that's where CISM itself becomes, again, a part of the continuum of care. It is not, again, a really big one, and I say this in my classes over and over, not therapy, and therapy has a huge role. Again, I had a CISM member, oh, I watched a YouTube video about psychological medication. I told people like, oh no, please don't, right? No. That's not what CISM is. That's where it is. But as a part of the continuum of care, just like you're choosing the horses and the dogs, that is a part of the continuum of care. It's not one model, it's all the models coming together to ensure I don't want to see that thin blue line anymore on my Facebook. Right? I don't want to get that, you know what I mean? And I'm glad when people call to say, hey, can you help me? Or 5 years ago you talked to me, and it changed my life, and you're like, thank you, right? You know what I mean? Again, as a CISM member, I was sometimes like, am I doing the right thing? Am I really helping? But you know what? That's what it is. And that's CISM in really a nutshell, I guess. So there is a lot of CISM models out there. The one I teach is governed by ICISF, International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, which is recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, the UN, the CIA, the American military. So it is, and this model by ICSF is built for first responders, mostly law enforcement. So that's why I chose that model, and that's why a lot of police agencies, Edmonton City Police uses it. I don't know if you guys know Roy Lager, he's the instructor for it. Actually, I had coffee with him yesterday. He's the chaplain. I know the sheriffs are looking at going to that model, so that's why that one model is preferred by police, because it was built for police. But again, I believe all the models work, just like physical first aid, there's St. John's, there's Red Cross. Anything to help people will help. But CISM cannot, like I said, I say this over and over, is not therapy, and it cannot become therapy because it is not that. It is a part of the model to refer. And I know Kathy gets a lot of phone calls from me, so.
I can pay my mortgage because of Dave.
For a multi-million mansion, right?
Yeah.
But that's really very important, because a lot of people mistake CISM for that, actually. And that's why if you Google online, is CISM bad? And that's what the argument is. I recently had an argument all over Facebook about this one, because the people thought CISM was therapy, but it is not therapy. Absolutely nothing to do with therapy. And it is a confidential model, just like boots on the ground, just like psychology. CISM is, without confidentiality, CISM does not exist. Because if I can't trust it, I tell you something, you know what I mean, and so that's it. So that's CISM. Any questions?
I always have questions.
Excellent.
First of all, Adeem, honestly, thank you so much for just really, I can't agree more when you said, you know, you were there on scene, saving lives, and I believe that. I believe that, like, right down to the core of my being,
100%.
that, you know, you guys being there, it's one thing to come to me a week later, right, but honestly, like, the fact that you're there and you're like, I get you, I hear you, and there's no doubt in my mind you've saved lives, there's no doubt, so thank you for that. 15
Yes,
years of that,
thank
it's amazing, really, really. You know, I took my CISM training when I was with the police, and I'm sure it was like 06, 07, and I really think that if there's been an evolution, it's been in the CISM realm, I think, you know, just around kind of like understanding sort of, you know, especially when you do like the debriefs, for instance, around like, you know, I was talking about like the vicarious trauma piece of, you know, like, are you recounting your role, and how is that with like other people around you, and like that kind of thing, and you know, it's just, there's just been improvements and improvements and improvements, and, you know, it's just so nice to see that, you know, it's really just, you know, I believe really started with a bunch of really well-meaning peer supporters that just needed a structure, and, you know, it's just grown to be this beautiful, you know, program, that service delivery around the world, right? So, how do you, like, because, you know, I was talking about the vicarious trauma and about, like, how do you take care of you, first of all, and then, like, second of all, like when it comes to that, because, you know, I know, for instance, just having been, you know, to critical incident scenes, the first thing they want to do is jump, like, oh my god, the guy came at me, and I had to shoot him, and you know what I mean, and it's just like, okay, you know, like, how do you prevent yourself from being a witness in court? And then second of all, like, how do you, you know, like, take care of yourself or set those boundaries when this person is just, like, sort of trauma dumping in the moment?
A bunch of questions there.
Yeah, I know, I have a million.
And thank you for that, right? It has evolved, so I'm gonna go back for a second for your point. It has evolved, because when I first started, it was a bunch of old ladies that were clerks, but now it's the tactical team members. I have 5 tactical team members on my team.
Love that.
Like, wow, like, right? When an old guy says to me, you know, it's too bad we didn't have this when I was young.
Yeah.
This old officer used to hang inmates back in the 50s and 60s. When he said this to me, I'm like, wow, thank you, right? Whenever I started out CISM, it was like, oh, are you here to give me a hug? And you're like, right? And now it's like, can we have CISM talk to us? So the big thing is CISM does not target the critical incident. We do hear this story, but we target their psychological response or reaction. So again, we're not therapists, but we see how they're doing. So I ask you how you're a part of that again. So stabilize is the S is that introduction. The acknowledgement phase is, hey Kathy, could you tell me what happened? And again, you say, well, you know why you're here. Well, no, I don't. I want to hear it from your point of view. I hear a small part of the story, but then how are you? We immediately move. And again, they always want to go back to the operational aspect. We do. The operational aspects are for management, for the unions. That is not for CISM. So we ensure in the introduction, that's what we are there for. I want to make sure you're okay. And that goes back to almost education about CISM. The CISM does not target operations. That's more for a different group, a different subset, right? So setting up those really solid boundaries really early on to ensure that that's what's happening. Even if they want to dump, we have to set a limit with the CISM, that we have to go to how they're doing. We want to move them into a happier place immediately. So that's going to be a big one. So I know that's because people say, well, what happens when they're dumping nonstop? I use the hot balloon, you know, a balloon analogy. I cannot let the balloon keep going and going and going. We have to stop it at some point. And so that's number one. Number two, how we're doing is, a big one is CISM teams make sure that other CISM team members are taken care of. In CISD's critical incident stress debriefings, I always have 2 members outside that do debrief the debriefers, we call it. We check in on each other, but also sometimes I spend half of the day when I teach CISM members how to take care of themselves. So also CISM members are actually mentally more healthier than I'll say the CX or the police officers or the firefighters. Why? Because they know all the techniques. They know the triggers. So the education of that, right? Being who you are. So we have fun days, we have team meetings. So a lot of times it is those education aspects. It is, so you become almost healthier by knowing what the triggers are, by knowing your PTSD peaked, right? So that's a part of the CISM, but CISM members are checked on by other CISM members. I recently attended an ICF conference, 2 years ago now, and something I'd like to bring forward is I know in the US, one of the CISM teams is they have to meet with the psychologist once a month if they're a CISM peer. I'm like, oh my God, we're not there yet in Canada, but, and the confidentiality about being pulled into court is because we don't target the operational aspect. In the US, it's a big issue, I'll be honest with you, and there's actually laws to protect CISM. In Canada, again, it's never been an issue yet.
Yeah.
So, I know it's I'm all over the map here, but so, because I don't know what happened in the incident, that's why we don't target the incident, so I really can't comment about the incident or if you pull me into court, good for you. You're not gonna get anything out of me, because I don't care about the operational aspect, so those are kinda the boundaries of those CISM aspects, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I think honestly, like, if someone was doing that, like where they're just trauma dumping, like I think you'd just be like, what? We never had that conversation.
And that's, there's no note taking, there's
I never took any notes with that. Yeah. You don't take any notes at all, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, I was tying my shoes when we were talking about that.
So I guess, it's kind of a combination of those things. Does that answer all your questions? Or?
No, it does. That's awesome. Like really, it's I'm a huge fan of the CIS. I know that it has a little bit of a stigma to it, but I think it's honestly like, it's the human factor of this stuff where people that join CISM teams, that join peer support teams, that do all this stuff, they're invested in the mental health of their colleagues and themselves and all of that stuff. And I think like, when you're like, it's not therapy, for sure it's not therapy, but you know what, people want to help, right? And so like, if there is overstepping, it's usually because they're just like, there's really well-meaning people that are like, maybe
But also, I've seen this. So I was a team lead at my site for many, many years, and there was people who would join for the gossip aspect. They were removed immediately.
Oh yeah.
Or the thing. So yes. So you are gonna have, and again, but all of a sudden, now it takes that person to give us a bad name.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Or like I said, where people make it into therapy, right?
Yeah.
Because when I teach, like I said, almost every class, I'll have 1 to 2 mental health professionals from across Canada, and a lot of them tell me after class, okay, I have to take off my therapy hat. It's like if you attend my class, because when we do the interventions, you always want to go to therapy.
Right.
And again, those 20 psychologists just showed up to debunk me. They thought that I was talking about therapy and childhood. Like, at no point did you bring that up. So that's where CISM kind of like, itself, it has to advocate for itself to say, whoa.
Yeah.
We are that. No, me and you are partners. We're not enemies, So, but again, but it's those therapists that also make CISM therapy. And I'm like, absolutely not.
Right.
So CISM itself has to advocate for itself and say,
100%.
we're just peers, that's it.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's a human factor. It's just a human factor thing. Like, mistakes happen and it's no big deal. But you're right. I think like that's what's really nice about the evolution of it is I think like, really like perhaps there's been some mistakes and like I think that's what helps shore up the program, right? So you can actually really kind of like structure it in a way that we are staying away from the operational side, or we are trying to get like these, kind of armchair therapists that are out, right? Or like the gossip piece, right? It's sort of like, because that happened at EPS a lot, where it was like, these people would join peer support and they were just immediately removed when you heard them kind of like.
And that's, that's happened.
You just have to protect
4
yourself.
or 5 times in my career. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
Again, maybe I owned it because I'm like, I thought they were gonna be good. And all of a sudden they're like, oh my God.
Yeah.
You hear about Janelle? She cried.
Right.
I said, oh my God.
You can't help that.
No, and it's normal. You know what I mean? It's gonna happen once in a while. Something's, again, that's in every job, right?
Yeah,
somebody gets in.
It's got nothing to do with CSM, right?
No, and it's not this. It's not the program. It's just a human factor.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Any other questions? Because there's a test after now.
Well, Adib, I know we're very grateful for CISM. I know when we have some of our major critical incidences, we've had CISM show up after the Foxtrot thing before we were back in the debrief. We had people sitting in that room saying, hey, we're here. And that was amazing. So, yeah, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
So, give that to somebody that you like or don't like. Okay, it's in your hands now. But
She
here,
does a lot for me, this girl.
this is how this is fit.
Perfect.
There you
I
go.
have this in my car right now, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Adib.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll try.
Well, guys, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
She's like, shit, yeah! We took one before I go home. Thanks for coming, everybody. Like, that was really awesome. Thank you for showing up. And, go back and tell everybody you fucked up, you messed up. There's still lots of food. We still, don't run away, eat some food. There's lots left there. We're going to try and do stuff like this on a more often basis, whatever, I can't speak. So I am not a presenter, obviously. All I know is CX Solid was created to help correctional officers. That is why we're here. That is what I'm trying to do. We have Carlina, board member, who does a lot of the home stuff with me. She's on tech support with me as well. Thea's back there. He is the unfortunate second half of my life. But he is my IT, and he's amazing because he just shuts up and does what I tell him to do. And that's how it should be, you know? So, but he is also a board member with CX Solid. And you know what, guys, it's really amazing when we can have a group of people together who can talk about things and are willing to spend their own days to come in and say, hey, this is what we're doing. We're here to help people. So thank you, everybody that came.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you for starting.
Absolutely.